Protesters across the nation have been marching against police brutality for really more than 30 days now. And the demonstrators continue to demand an end to what many consider modern-day lynchings of black men and women in America. Cases that have fallen through the cracks, though, some of them dating as far back as 100 years ago, are now getting the attention they deserve. Jonathan Smith is the former chief of the Special Litigation Section at the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and he joins us now to talk a little bit more about some of these cases. So, Jonathan, the case that we had brought up was Max Mason, right? He was accused of raping a white woman in 1920. There were 3 other men who were lynched in the process of this case, if I remember the details accurately. And he was posthumously pardoned 100 years later. My first sort of reaction was, it's a little late. So I want to ask you, Jonathan, why is it important to take a second look at these cases and correct the wrongs that were made if they were made so long ago?
As we look at this moment in time, as people are in the streets talking about the racial inequities that have been created by our criminal legal system, it's incredibly important that we understand the origins of those inequities and that we look very carefully at the history that has led us to this moment where communities of color feel tremendous injustice in our criminal legal system through not just although importantly we see the deaths at the hands of police, but the over-incarceration of communities of color, the discrimination that occurs from people who have criminal convictions that is significantly, disproportionately felt by communities of color. And that history didn't just happen in the modern era. That's not something that occurred overnight or is of recent origin. That is a problem that has existed since the founding of this nation. And understanding that history and correcting the injustices that have occurred in the past is an important part of our reckoning, finding some moment in which we can say, this is what our criminal legal system does. This is the way our criminal legal system functions. This is its origins of it. And in order to take the steps needed to fix it today, we need to understand where we came from.
What I thought of in understanding why this is sort of happening now, I actually thought to myself, have we seen this before? And the only thing that I could think of was perhaps in 1994, when Byron D. LeBeckwith, the man who was accused of shooting Medgar Evers 30 years before that, in 1964, was finally brought to justice because of the efforts of the Justice Department to keep that case alive and finally bring Mr. D. LeBeckwith to justice. That's one example that harkens back to the civil rights era. Is that the only one up until this point, or have there been other moments in history where our justice system has attempted to do this, but now we're seeing it on a more consistent basis because of the fact that we are living in very different times now?
So you've seen an effort to try to resurrect and to try to address some of the unresolved criminal cases from the civil rights era. You saw Mississippi burning cases that were prosecuted. The Civil Rights Division, it wasn't my section, but the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division opened up a whole unit to try to investigate the cold cases from the civil rights era. And so there's been an effort in the past to kind of reconcile and reckon with some of that history. But on the point you make about we've been here before, I think that is sort of a critically important question for us to look at as we look at the protest movement we have, on the streets today. Because as much as we've been here before to look at the racialized way in which our criminal system ignored violence and terrorism against Black people and participated in the terrorism against communities of color throughout certainly the civil rights era and the Jim Crow era, and then through mass incarceration and the war on crime and really becoming the war on poverty and people of color. We've also been here as a protest movement on policing. And if you think back at the moments in our history, even really in the last half of the 20th century, starting with the Children's March in Birmingham and the reaction of the Congress and the president to what happened there that led to the introduction of the Civil Rights Act, the official violence against the people crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge that led to the introduction of the Voting Rights Act. You saw, what happened in the wake of the death of Rodney King, what happened in the wake of the death of Abner Louima, and Eleanor Bumpers, and so many other people have died at the hands of police. That led to sort of uprisings in communities across the country. We've been in a moment where, in those times, there's been an urgency for reform. And then we've returned back to business as usual. And if you map out the last half of the 20th century, it's almost literally every 5 years. And, we're now about 5 years out from Michael Brown. I think there was real hope in the wake of Michael Brown's death that we would see real change in this country. And I think one of the reasons why you're seeing so many people out on the street today and why these demonstrations are sustained and so energetic and are going to be sustained over time is the disappointment that the work that was done in the wake of Michael Brown's death didn't bring the change that communities were looking for. And so we reckon with this past, and we reckon with this problem, and then we set it aside and we move on to other things. And I think this time can and should be different to reckon with this past and bring about real, sustained, and lasting change.
Yeah, you bring up sort of the question of momentum, like how much momentum do we have to continue this? And, the one thing a lot of people have pointed out is when you look at those protests, you see an awful lot of white faces. You see all kinds of people. And I think that maybe that might have been one of the key differences when you look back at other times when people took to the streets outraged. Black faces might have outnumbered white faces, but now not so much. And I wonder if you think that that's part of what hopefully will help to keep the momentum going, that even white people are outraged and want to see the past injustices resurrected and corrected.
And I think it's not. I think while it's important to correct the past injustices, I think that the most important piece of reckoning, the reconciliation with our history, is to understand how we fix it and what the changes that are going to be needed. When you think about what we're seeing coming out of our legislative bodies around the country in response to this moment, it's not things that are going to be as meaningful as I think the protest movement would hope them to be. If you look at the bill that was passed in the House of Representatives, there's not a single thing in that bill that would have saved George Floyd's life. And so I think that, the momentum is going to be sustained when these measures that are largely tinkering around the edges are exposed for what they are, and the communities are going to insist that we think differently about policing. And that's why the history, I think, is really important for us to reconcile with. I don't think particularly the white community has a real recognition for sort of what the history of policing has been in this country, how it operates, what it feels like. When I talk to people I represent, or people in communities where I've done investigations, and they talk about the fear of leaving their front door every day because they're going to be stopped by the police simply because of the color of their skin, or the fear of getting in their car to drive because they know that the risk is they're going to be pulled over. And when you look at every one of those encounters, is not only risky for the threat of a criminal prosecution or an arrest, but for a shooting. When you think of Philando Castile was stopped something like 42 times before the stop that resulted in his death, you begin to understand what the experience of an African American, particularly African American man, is like, just living day to day and the pressure that places. And I think we have to reconcile with our past to understand that present and to make the fundamental changes that are necessary to address what that present is. So going forward, we can make reparations for the past, and we can create a more just society.
Can I ask you just briefly before you go, why haven't we seen a similar shift from the protests amplify the cases of the trans community?
So I think we're starting to see, particularly the Black trans community's voice is starting, I think, to be heard. You've seen, incredible organizers in the trans community that are out there leading some of the demonstrations and being at the forefront. And more than ever, when I'm out and at the demonstrations, seeing the trans community represented in a positive and effective way, I think we're really starting to see some change there. And it has been like many times the movement has movements end up marginalizing portions of their community, and I think that this movement and what we're seeing the protests today are doing a much more effective job of recognizing all the forms of discrimination, and particularly the intersectionality where discrimination, based on race, layered on top of status as a trans person or an LGBT person, magnifies the impact of that discrimination. And so I'm actually optimistic by the attention that's finally being paid to the way in which police discriminate against and the abuses against the trans community, both the over-policing and the underserving of that community, and the need for us to have real fundamental reform there to respect all people who need public safety.
Jonathan Smith, thank you very much. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.